Good morning, fellas. You know me, Musne?
Very well.
Very well, yeah. I'm here to present to you Commissar Ivor Sarakinsky. He has a PhD in political studies from Wits University and lecture in the School of Governance at Wits. He has supervised and published his own research in scholarly journal. He has also worked in government as a chief director in the Economic Development Department and done applied consulting projects in the range of areas from PADS APRM to the current expanded public work program. Please welcome Commissar Ivor. Thank you, sir. Thank you very much.
Well, let me thank Asri and Sumaya for inviting me to speak to you this morning. I always love doing these kinds of interventions because the kind of discussions and the relevance of this kind of discussion shouldn't be restricted simply to universities and classrooms. It's fundamentally important that these kinds of debates happen and the information around them disseminated widely, because it's fundamental to people being active citizens and being able to influence and shape and direct public institutions. So it's really important that us academics get out the classroom, get out the consulting room, and engage and discuss these really important issues with people who involved in making communities better. So as a social outreach initiative, ASRI is fantastic. I did a quick search on the net, and it's a great initiative, and it's an honor to be invited to contribute to this program. So let's try and set out where we want to go in our discussions this morning in terms of government and public institutions. We're going to talk about government generally first, and then we'll talk about the specifics of Parliament thereafter, with a short break in between, and then we'll have questions on both topics at the end of my input. And it's wonderful timing for me to talk to you about some of these issues, because later today we've got the budget speech. And the budget speech brings everything that we're going to talk about together and more in place. And hopefully, once we've finished our discussions, you'll get a sense of why the budget is so important and what this means for the functioning of government at national, provincial, and even local level going forward. And also why this budget speech is perhaps the most important budget speech that we're going to hear or have heard in about the last 20 years of democracy. This really is a watershed budget speech. And perhaps in question time we could thrash out some of the themes that might come out in that based on what's coming in a moment. So lots to talk about, and I've only been given 40 minutes. And academics can talk. So my commissar colleague is going to holding me to account and keep me disciplined. So if I shoot over time, I'll be notified and be forced to come back on track. But I've thought the topics through, and I was given a very clear and helpful terms of reference, and I'm going to try and stick to that, and then we can talk more broadly in questions and answers thereafter. So let's start our discussion off by looking at the whole debate, the whole controversy about government, a broad government overview. Now, the whole issue of government is captured in a very simple phrase which I'm sure you've heard, which is called the separation of powers. So you've got your judiciary, you've got your legislature, and you've got your executive. And when we talk about government, we talk about the political party that comes to power, hopefully through an election, that takes control of the organs of state and directs the organs of state to implement policies linked to the mandate the people gave it. So straight away, when we talk about government, we're talking about a political entity that's in office for a short period of time. In South Africa, it's 5 years. In other countries, it's 4 years. And every 5 years, there's an election. You can have changes in party in power. You can have changes in leadership of parties that come back into power. But that's the government. And it makes up the executive. So the government is your head of state. It's your ministers, so it's your cabinet, it's your ministers, and it's also the bureaucracy. So the political heads come and go, and the bureaucracy is much more permanent because your bureaucrats, your officials are appointed. So they're not subject to elections, so they are there for as long as they want the job. Your political heads change. And it's up to your political heads to make sure that these guys do the work needed to implement the manifesto and the policies of the party that wins the election. So straight away you can see there's a tension. Guys here might not agree with the manifestos and policies of the party that has the responsibility to direct these institutions. And all kinds of dynamics start to happen between political heads and administrative heads. And we call that the political administrative interface. And it's a highly political, highly tension-ridden, highly conflictual relationship. So the political heads wants 1,000 houses. The administrative head says we can't do that. At best, we can do 150. And you've got a whole range of tensions around that. We don't have the capacity. We don't have the people. The budgets aren't right. If there's no money, we can't build 1,000 houses. And as a political head, you're making promises to the people to get votes, and we don't have the capacity, the resources to implement the policies that you're making promises about. So there's a toing and froing between political heads and administrative heads. And this tension around the world, South Africa is no different to any country in the world at this level. This tension happens at provincial level, or regional level, or state level in America. And it happens at local level in South Africa and local government anywhere else in the world. So you've got a built-in tension in democratic systems between your elected executive members who are there to steer politically the organs of state, the machinery to implement policy, the organs of state, your permanent civil servants, as opposed to your elected civil servants. So, separation of powers, and we'll come to the legislature in our second discussion shortly. Constitutions, legislation defines the powers that each of these spheres has. And we're just talking about the executive at the moment. So how do governments around the world function in terms of translating an electoral mandate into policy implementation? That's the trick in this whole game. And at country level, clearly you can't have every issue being discussed at cabinet. You can't expect the head of state to, in one person's mind, understand all the issues that need to be addressed in a country. So what happens around the world is that underneath the cabinet, you have the establishment of a number of cabinet committees. So you've got a number of cabinet committees who have specialized functions, specialized support, who investigate and interrogate policy issues relevant to them to advise cabinet, and cabinet makes a decision on policy thereafter. And in South Africa, we've got 6 cabinet committees, and I'll read them out to you. There's a cabinet committee for the social sector, so that's health, social development, education, and others. I'm just giving some quick examples to illustrate the kinds of departments that would be in the social sector. So in the social sector, the Minister of Health, the Minister of Social Development, the Minister of Education, higher and basic, will be members of that cabinet committee. Then you've got the economic sector cabinet committee, and there you'll have Department of Economic Development, Small Business, Department of Trade and Industry, Department of Finance, and a range of other departments as well. Believe it or not, Environment Affairs is quite an important member of that department too. Then in South Africa, we've got a third one, which is closely linked to the economic one. It's called Investment and Employment. And there you would possibly have some repetition in terms of the members of that committee. But you can see the different focus in that third one I've mentioned. Investment and employment. In other words, how do we drive investment? It's not just about expanding the economy in terms of agro-processing and mining and stuff. What do we have to do in terms of our regulatory framework to make our country attractive as an investment destination? And how do we translate that investment into jobs? So a very narrow focus on that third committee. And that tells us a lot about how the executive is prioritizing issues in South Africa. It's quite rare to have such a narrow cabinet committee. Cabinet committees are generally quite broad. So this is interesting. It tells us a lot about how the executive understands the challenges that South Africa faces. A fourth one is international relations, peace and security. So that's our diplomatic operations around the world, and it's important to emphasize peace and security, and that focuses on South Africa's role in peacekeeping in Africa. So a whole cabinet cluster on peacekeeping in Africa, in addition to normal diplomatic channels. That is also very revealing. It tells us a lot about South Africa's foreign policy priorities. Another one, a very important one, the Justice, Crime Prevention and Security Cabinet Committee. And that's the police, the army, the intelligence agencies, and their whole operations about dealing with security, crime, justice issues in South Africa. And then the last one, governance and administration, the sixth one. And the main departments in that cabinet cluster are Home Affairs and the Department of Public Service and Administration, as well as the Public Service Commission. They might be called into that on special issues. So straight away when we start to talk about high-level cabinet committees, we get a sense of what the priorities, what the policy objectives are of the government in office. And this has changed in South Africa. Over the years, there used to be 4, then there were 5, now there's 6. So this changes in terms of the political heads that come into office and how they understand the priorities that need to be addressed in South Africa. And I focused on that interesting one about investment and employment, being very revealing in this context. So you've got these cabinet committees, and what do? They coordinate all the relevant departments and ministries dealing with an issue that's part of their mandate. So they play a fundamentally important coordinating role. And let me give you an example of this. If you are going to have a foster care grant for children, it's not just social development that has to drive that foster care grant. You need education to be involved there. You need social development and welfare services to be involved there. You need finance to be involved there in terms of costing the foster care grant. You need security to be there in terms of making sure that the children are safe. So these cabinet committees have permanent members, and they can call in ad hoc members depending on the issue that they're dealing with. And all these policy issues are incredibly complicated, and it's never one ministry or one department on its own that can drive an initiative. You have to have a whole range of departments coming together to achieve policy outcomes. And these cabinet committees are crucial in coordinating the relevant departments on policy issues.
So do cabinet committees frequently meet two at one time? So in the foster care example, you've got economic and the other one meeting. Is that how it happens?
They meet, they've got scheduled meetings, frequencies. It's normally once, it used to be once a fortnight. It's probably slowed down a bit now because cabinet meets once a fortnight as well. So they probably aim to meet once a month. So that if they meet once a month, they've got a secretariat. Each one of these cabinet committees will have a secretariat to make sure that the decisions are carried through and the work that was agreed that needs to be done is done by the people that it's been delegated to. So there's a whole administrative structure underneath each of the cabinet committees.
But when the issue touches two different committees,
Yes.
both committees will meet together?
Well, you'll have a lead committee,
Okay.
and then you'll draw in ad hoc members from the other committee. So the child care grant is driven by social development, for example. So it will be in the social cabinet committee. And then if there's a security concern, then you'll bring in someone from the police, the juvenile unit in the police, as an ad hoc member to clarify what the constitution, the rule says about juvenile protection. So you've got these structures and a little bit of ad hocing in between. So it seems neat, but in reality it's quite messy. And this is where policy analysis becomes quite nice, because who's being drawn in, and were they at the previous one, and did they come to the next one, and if not, what's been lost in the process, because these high-level people are very busy and very important, and sometimes things happen and they can't attend all of these meetings and things go wrong. So it's not perfect. I'm presenting it in a linear way, but reality is sometimes a little bit messier than this. So there are these formal set up cabinet committees. There's also a thing called an interministerial committee, an IMC. And these IMCs are set up on an ad hoc basis. So if there's a pressing issue that is important, but not big enough to dominate the agenda of a meeting of a formal cabinet committee, what will happen is that the relevant ministers will form a small ad hoc committee, and these are called interministerial committees. And they're tasked with dealing with very narrow focused issues. So when I was in government, I contributed to one of the IMCs that was established at the time. It was the IMC on the square kilometre array. It was just before we won the bid to hold the square kilometre array in the Northern Cape. And I made a presentation on various issues to that IMC. So there were 5 ministers in that IMC. So we won the bid, that IMC dissolved, and the decision of implementing the square kilometre array was transferred to the bureaucracy in the Department of Science and Development under the political leadership of the Minister, Dr. Naledi Pandor. So you can see how decisions get translated into policy and then transferred to a line function ministry once that process has unfolded. So it's not an easy process, this. There are backwards and forwards and twists and turns, but that's how the system tends to work. So these political bodies, the IMC, the Cabinet Committee, will make decisions, and then those decisions have to get translated into political action through this machinery which we spoke about. And again, not any single department bureaucracy can implement these complex decisions on their own. So you need coordination across what we call the line function bureaucracies of departments. And to coordinate all the bureaucracies at line function level, South Africa has a thing called FOSAD. And government loves acronyms. Forum of South African Directors General. So all the administrative heads of all these public bureaucracies are members of FOSAD. And FOSAD is divided into committees that represent the formal cabinet committees that we've discussed. So political decisions made in one of these cabinet committees will be passed on to the respective FOSAD committee for coordinated bureaucratic coordination for implementation. So if you want to ensure that aged grants arrive at aged people efficiently and effectively, and that aged people are safe, FOSAD has to coordinate officials from social development, from police, from health, from a whole range of departments to arrive at a system where aged people can get their grant, get home safely without being attacked in between where they collect their grant. So the implementation happens here at FOSAD level, and the decision, political level, happens out here at cabinet committee level. So we've got our principles here in terms of separation of powers, the executive government, how that works. We've got a sense of the committees that are relevant at national level, and my mandate is to talk about local government as well. And it's quite easy once we have this in place, because local government follows this structure quite closely. But you've got different names for the committees, and you've got different names for the office bearers. So at local level, instead of a head of state, who's the political head of a municipality? It's the mayor. So you've got the mayor. Instead of a cabinet, what do you have? It's called various things around the world. In South Africa, it's called an MMC, MEC, member of the something municipal executive committee. I think it's municipal something executive committee. And then you'll have MMCs, and these are members of the mayoral committee, and they are the political heads of bureaucracies at local level. So you'll have an MMC of roads in Johannesburg, and then you'll have the bureaucracy in terms of the Johannesburg Road Agency, and they'll make decisions of a 24-hour turnaround to fix potholes. It's a political decision. And then these guys have to put in place a management system to fix the potholes within 24 hours of it being reported. So So the implementation is here, the decisions there. And as we've said, there's tension between political heads and administrative heads. The same tensions we spoke about at national level occur here at local level. You'll also have committees in the same way that you have committees at national level. So Johannesburg, I think, is divided up into 6 clusters. I can't remember all the names of them, but there's a sustainable development one. There's an economic one, and a finance one, I think. And they perform the same kinds of functions that we've already discussed, but they do it at local level as opposed to national level. And the reason why you have these bodies at local level is that you want to ensure that the micro needs of communities can be addressed. So if people are unsafe on the roads because of potholes, you want to be able to ensure that corrective action takes place. So you want some kind of responsiveness built into your system, and that's where the political heads come in, because political heads need electoral support. You lose votes or you lose an election, you're out of office. And it's us as voters that keep these guys focused, or should keep these guys focused on doing what is in our interests as opposed to their own interests. And then they, under pressure from us, make sure that these guys do their work. So there we have, in very broad terms, the whole issue of the committee structure, how government functions. And we'll take questions on this. I've simplified it terribly. There's many, many twists and turns in all of this. But I'm trying to pull out some key themes. I need now to talk about the role of the Auditor General's Office. Now, the Auditor General's Office has constitutionally defined powers to audit the accounts of national, provincial, and local government institutions. So in South Africa, as is the case in many countries around the world, the different levels of government can't prevent the Auditor General from auditing how they spend public money. It's defined in law in some cases. In other cases, the powers of the AG are set out very clearly in the Constitution. And in South Africa, our powers and functions of the AG are set out in the Constitution amongst those of what we call the Chapter 9 institutions. So in our Constitution, we enable the setting up of autonomous bodies with protected statutory powers, legally binding powers, to audit the finances of all the 3 tiers of government: national, provincial, local. And none of these tiers can resist or withhold information. So you've got a whole lot of regulatory frameworks that enable the Auditor General to do its work. And the first one is an act that's quite unpopular in the public service. People don't like it. It's the Finance Act. It's just slipped my mind. The PFMA, the Public Finance Management Act. The Public Finance Management Act sets out very clear rules on how departments get their budget, how they plan their expenditure, how they organize their reporting on their expenditure. And then the Auditor General will come and audit them on how they've spent that money in terms of their strategic objectives. and it will test compliance with Treasury regulations in terms of proper appropriations of public money. So to spend public money is very hard in the public service. You've got to write submissions and you've got to comply with huge amounts of paper and knowledge and rules to turn money in the budget into houses at a community, at local level. All of that has to go through a complicated process of requisitioning and accessing money. And it doesn't just happen at the push of a switch. It's a paper chase driven process where you write documents and you show in accordance with clause ABC of document XYZ why money from here has to go there. And you spell out the line items that you're going to spend that money on. And then the Auditor General comes in and assesses how you've acquired that money, if it's procedurally correct, and whether you have spent that money efficiently and appropriately. So the Auditor General will then look at the accounts and will declare a clean audit if the department has done everything well. So the one option is your clean audit. And political heads love to get clean audits because it shows that they're on top of the game. Not many departments at national and provincial level, as well as municipal level, get clean audits. It's more common to get a qualified audit where the Auditor General picks up some irregularities. And some of the qualified audits can be quite serious in terms of listing serious irregularities in how money has been turned into activities. And you'll see things which will be coming in the budget this afternoon. A phrase, fruitless and wasteful expenditure. The Auditor General loves that phrase. Fruitless and wasteful expenditure. Unauthorized expenditure. So you spent money, but you didn't follow the process properly in accessing that money for your task. You didn't comply with the regulatory framework. So qualified audits don't necessarily mean corruption. They might, but they don't necessarily mean corruption, because it might mean that you've got a pressing task to do and the paperwork is so complicated that you just access the money to build houses or to build clinics, and then afterwards the Auditor General qualifies that. But you've used the money honestly for the right reasons, but the process is so cumbersome that it can undermine delivery in some cases. It's very difficult to do that. So that's how the Auditor General ensures that departments, as we've discussed, at national, provincial and local level, comply with the regulatory frameworks. At municipal level, you've got similar legislation to the PFMA, but it's called the MFMA, the Municipal Finance Management Act. And a lot of the institutions and personnel, the names change here, but the structure of the legislation is quite similar. And for those interested in local government, you need to look at other legislation aligned to the MFMA, called the Municipal Systems Act. Because that will set out how municipalities have to operate in terms of accessing public money in order to build roads, fix roads, put water in, put power into houses, take refuse away on a weekly basis, the really hard stuff of public service. It's highly regulated. So how much time do I have left?
No.
Enough. Okay. Let's try and start to compare these levels, national, local, and let's try and get a sense. Let's leave provincial out for the moment. There's big debate in South Africa about the relevance of provincial governments. And there's a debate that's forthcoming. The extremes of that debate will be to abolish provinces completely, to have national and expand the size of local governments and reduce the number of local governments. And the other extreme will be to reduce the number of provinces but keep the system more or less intact. And the reality in 5-10 years might be a compromise between those two extreme positions. So the role of provinces is really up in the air. It's part of a big ongoing debate at the moment. So let's look at national and local, because that's really where the action happens. Now, at national level, what are the kinds of decisions that are made? They're often regulatory decisions, they're often strategic decisions. There are very few departments at national level that are involved in implementation. Home Affairs is one that is involved in implementation. But if you think about it, what do most of the departments and ministries do at national level? They make policy. They give direction to other tiers of government to implement. So Environment Affairs at national level is not an implementing department. It monitors environmental management policy at provincial and local level. So the easy work, let's say the easier work, is at national level. It's high level, it's strategic, and you manage people in terms of formulating policies. The outputs are very different at national level to local level. And this is where the crunch comes, because it's at local level where the implementation occurs, generally speaking. So everyone wants to be at national level. Those are the nice jobs. When I was Chief Director in Economic Development, we just wrote policy documents and we'd go and talk to municipalities and provinces about our policy documents and how they must implement them. Wonderful, easy, it's fun. It's at local level where the really hard stuff happens. So if national's where the fun is, you've got an incentive of people wanting to be in national departments and not to be at local level departments, because at local level departments it's delivery oriented. So this is where you've got to prove that you're doing stuff, that you're changing people's lives in a real way. You're building roads, you're building houses, you're picking up rubbish, you're clearing sewage, you're providing clean and potable water, you're providing electricity. There's no room to hide at local level. There's lots of room to hide at national level.
So if, I guess local level is the department then that is doing the most work, why is it that it's neglected regarding resources then?
Absolutely.
And it's the parliamentarians and the ministers that are obviously living that luxurious life or having all the luxuries of the ones on the ground.
That's exactly the question. That's exactly it. It's nice up here, it's hard down here. And in terms of resource allocation, you're right, there's a disjuncture. And part of the reason for that, and it's a bit of a sidetrack, but it's worth pursuing because you raised a really important issue, is at national and provincial level, the finances are raised through general taxes. It's company tax, private individual earning tax. So the tax base at national and provincial level is different to the tax base at local level. At local level, municipalities generate revenue from rates on property. So every month on your account, you'll pay a rate, depending on the value of your property and the size of your property. More valuable, bigger, higher the monthly rate. So rates is the key source of revenue for municipalities. Can you see the discrepancy already in terms of available resource compared to national provincial in terms of general income tax? So we're watching the budget this afternoon because we know tax is going up at national level. It's going to go up, whether it's VAT or it's an increase in other taxes. We know taxes are going up. What can municipalities do? You can't push rates above a certain level because then you impact on households. What other sources of revenue are there at local level? Business licenses, traffic fines, dog licenses, that kind of stuff. So there's a crazy situation around the world where the hard work of government at local level has the toughest job generating the finance to do that hard work.
And we shouldn't.
No, absolutely. It should be the other way around. General tax should go to local government first, and if there's any left over, fund your provincial and national institutions, because making laws and making decisions is very and managing is very different to implementing and making stuff happen, putting pipes in the ground to get water from area A to area B.
And even if it doesn't need to be that dramatic, because obviously now it's been years where the parliamentarians are getting taxed as their resources. But even if it's divided into half, just to start that off, and then in the end you can divert it, you can invert it.
Watch the budget later on this issue in terms of cost cutting at national, provincial level.
Sorry, I really don't know how these work, but I've heard about them. Of course, I'm hoping maybe you can clarify. How do municipal bonds then fit into this situation?
Yes.
And do they help with funding?
Yeah. Now, municipal bonds will be leveled to generate funding for particular projects. So it's like in the private sector. If you want to raise finance for an enterprise, you've got various ways of generating finance. You can go to the markets, you can issue shares, etc. What municipalities sometimes do, and it tends to happen mainly at municipal level, not at national level, is that the municipality will say, we want to drive infrastructure. So we're going to set up an infrastructure bond. So if you give us 100,000 Rand over 5 years, we'll give you 7% interest per annum over 5 years. And at the end of 5 years, when that bond expires, you'll get your money back plus that cumulative interest. So bonds are a pretty safe investment for people because governments tend to pay their debts. There are some exceptions. But South Africa's got a very good record in paying its debts. So if a municipality raises a bond, it's a pretty safe investment to say over 5 years or 10 years, and you've got different bonds. Bonds are generally between 10 and 20 years. So you're saying, I'll put money in now, and in 20 years' time, I'll get that money plus interest back. And in the meantime, the municipality uses the money generated through people putting money into the bond to build infrastructure for water, electricity, or whatever. So it's a way of generating finance to do big projects at local level. But that's still got to be paid back. Eh? So what's the revenue base of municipalities to pay that money back? So there are risks. And that's where the ratings agencies come in. And watch this afternoon for ratings agencies. They'll do an assessment of the municipal bond, and they'll categorize it A, B, or B++, or B- or C. And that means that they're saying that the municipality is either in a strong position to pay that money back in 20 years' time, or they're not. And if it's low rating, it means high risk. If it's high risk, it means be careful. And this is a big issue at national level with South Africa and the rating agencies. Our grading for investors is under threat. And if our rating goes down, we're in big trouble. But we can pursue that in questions, because there's a whole subtext there and a whole sub-issue.
Can municipalities carry debt for day-to-day things?
No. Yeah, the Municipal Finance Management Act is very, very clear on that. So the Auditor General will come up with things like fruitless and wasteful expenditure, and give a qualified audit because you haven't managed your budget properly and you have fallen into debt. And then you have to explain. And then in terms of the MFMA, if people have behaved badly, they should be disciplined, either internally or through a criminal process. But that unfortunately doesn't happen as often as it should. Yeah.
In reality, it's always the case that the wealthy pay more tax and rates compared to the ones who are less fortunate.
Yes, that's exactly it. Yeah, and that's where you set your tax levels. And we're watching this afternoon precisely for that issue. I'm expecting something along the lines of a wealth tax. So people above a certain level are going to pay excessive taxes to redistribute from the rich to the poor. And I think that's perfectly justifiable. I don't have a problem with that at all. At local level, it's a real problem because you're limited to very narrow sources of income, and yet you've got a huge mandate to deliver on. And this is one of the big challenges of local government. But let me finish this and then we'll take another question. Now, what happens if you're a municipality like Johannesburg? You've got Sandton, you've got this area, Rosebank, and a couple of other areas where the properties are quite large and the communities are quite wealthy and the properties are really valuable. So your rates base is quite strong. But what about a municipality in the Northern Cape, like Kuruma? Do they have areas like Sandton? No. Which means that the rates base in that municipality is almost non-existent. And yet you've got huge need in Kuruma because of historical and other legacies. So the municipality needs to give even more free water, more free electricity, build even more houses. But the rates base doesn't support that. So what you have in South Africa, like many other countries around the world, is at national level you have a way of giving grants through national treasury where you distribute resources out of the general national tax base to poorer municipalities. But it's never enough for them to do what they need to do. It helps, but it's never enough. And this is one of the dilemmas of local government, is that it's nice if you're Johannesburg, or Tshwane, or eThekwini, or Ekurhuleni, but what about those other 250 odd municipalities isolated from the mainstream economy in South Africa, where you don't have such a tax base? And that's where the poor are. That's where the landless people are. That's where the homeless people are. That's where you've got your legacies of the Bantustan system in South Africa, where you've got massive social need. Your municipalities don't have the resource, the financial resource, to address those kinds of challenges. So municipal finance is a very, very tricky, complicated issue. So Treasury will distribute grants. You'll have the Finance and Fiscal Commission. Another acronym. Finance and Fiscal Commission that will do statistical analysis of revenue and how to divide it up provincially and locally in terms of redistribution. And that's lovely policy work, if people are interested in that. To equalize access to resources based on income, scarce, limited, finite.
What kind of innovative solutions have they found so far? Like, what's stopping?
Unfortunately, the solutions used are not innovative at all. They're quite damaging. Because many municipalities in South Africa generate revenue by on-selling electricity to consumers. So the municipality buys electricity from Eskom at X and sells it to residents at X plus 7%. And that 7% is used in their operational budgets. So the price of electricity for residents goes up. So the rich can absorb it, of course. The poor get hammered very hard because we haven't creatively and innovatively investigated the challenges of local government finance. Major area. Nice question. How are we with time for section one?
We can break for 5 minutes.
Going very far, very quickly. And I'm just trying to give a sense of the issues, the trends, the dynamics. in question time, we could pull out these things in a bit more detail. They're incredibly complicated. Government work is the hardest work in the world. If you can function effectively in this, you can manage in the private sector with your one eye closed. This is really, really hard stuff. It really, really is. So in our previous session, we spoke about the executive side at national and local level, how it works in terms of political mandates, and how policies are made and how policies are implemented, and what the basic principles of financial management were, and the role of the Auditor General being the decider on whether public funds are being used properly or not, and the whole issue of clean audits as we discussed. And that runs down the line at all three tiers: national, provincial, local, different names, different bodies, but similar process. The second part of our discussion focuses on the legislature. And things start to get quite complicated when we talk about the legislature. Because in a sense, the executive isn't completely separate from the legislature. There are some exceptions in democracies around the world, but let's try and get a sense of why I say that at one level we've got a separation of powers, legal constitutional definitions of what the judiciary, the legislature, and the executive can do and how they are constituted. But in many, many democracies around the world, at times, the boundary line between the two is quite blurred. And again, in South Africa, this occurs at national, provincial, and local level. So in South Africa, you have an election. And after the election, you've got a whole lot of parties being represented in Parliament nationally in terms of the number of votes they've got. So we've got a proportional representation system. So you work, there are 400 seats at National Parliament, and then you translate 400 seats into the percentages that each of the parties get in the election. So Party A will get 10 seats, Party B will get 50 seats, Party C will get a number of seats. And one of the first things that happens once you've constituted the legislature in terms of the constitutional system we have in South Africa is that the legislature will appoint the national executive in terms of the head of state. So there's some confusion in South Africa, and let's just be very clear on our terminology here. In South Africa, following the Westminster United Kingdom system, the majority vote in the legislature, in the House of Assembly, determines who the head of state is. It's not the majority party in the legislature, it's the majority vote in the legislature. So obviously the majority party has a significant advantage, but when you move from the legislature to the executive, the office and the transfer of power takes place in terms of a majority vote. In other words, when you appoint the executive of a country in a democracy, you want to start to dilute the antagonisms at a political level so that your executive starts to have national symbolism and national representativity. And that's why you emphasize majority vote in the legislature. And the same occurs at provincial level in your provincial legislatures, and the same in some ways occurs at local level in terms of your town councils. It's different in South Africa at local level because your mayors are appointed by the president. So the council doesn't appoint the executive as happens here at national level. So if Party A is part of the majority party here, the head of state will appoint the mayor of a town council where that same party has a majority at local level. That can change. It's a convention, it's not a law. Okay, so we've got a sense now that in a democracy, after an election, you constitute the executive. And once the head of state's in place, the head of state appoints the cabinet, the ministers, they swear their oath in the legislature, and then they take political control of these administrative organs that we've discussed. So what are the other kinds of things that happen in the legislature? And I'm going to spend a bit of time on national and then talk about councils separately, because they are quite different in many, many important respects. So the first thing legislatures do, and it comes out of the name, is that they pass laws. They are responsible for the drafting and enacting of legislation. So the first task of the legislature is legislative, to pass law. And that's the easy one. And lawmaking goes through a whole complicated process. In South Africa, the executive will draft a bill, and then that bill will go to the legislature, and you will have hearings. You'll have internal committee hearings, you will have public participatory hearings, where the special committee in Parliament responsible for that legislation will have to go on a country roadshow to take comment from people on that bill. And then it will be read a second time, and there'll be debate in the House, and amendments will be made, and then it will be read a third time, and it's only at the third reading that it will be voted on, and if there's majority, it will be enacted. But that doesn't mean it's in force, because all legislation only becomes valid or only becomes effective when it is signed off by the executive head, which is the state president. So you can see that there's a toing and froing between the executive and the legislature in the passage of legislation. And in between that processes, you build in very, very clear stages for public participation. And this isn't through political appointed reps. We're talking about direct participation. The processes are very, very clear in terms of this. And I think there are clauses in the Constitution that make this possible, in that you have to allow ordinary people to comment on law, even though representatives are shaping it in parliamentary committees. So in South Africa, we've built very powerful clauses into our system that enable citizens to shape legislation. So what examples are there where this process has been shaped quite significantly by public participation broadly defined, outside of your formal committee structures in Parliament? Well, there are two that came to mind when I was thinking of this. The first one is one that we all feel quite strongly about, e-tolls. Remember e-tolls? It went all the way to the Constitutional Court. The issue's not over yet. And the fight was over meaningful consultation. And if you consult, you can't just call a meeting with 20 people and say, we've consulted, we've made our decision on the basis of that consultation. The fight was about, you didn't allow ordinary citizens to express their view, and therefore your decision to implement e-tolls and the mechanism used didn't meet the needs of people. And that fight is still ongoing. It's far from over. And that just shows how powerful these instruments are in enabling citizens to participate outside of these formal processes, to shape policy, to shape legislation. The other one, which is very, very important and very, very interesting as well, is the bill. It hasn't been signed off by the head of state yet, although it's been voted on in Parliament, is the Protection of State Information Bill. And I call it a bill because it's only an act once the head of state has signed it off into law. So Parliament has voted on it and the majority said it's okay, but the head of state is sitting on it because it's a time bomb. It's very, very controversial. There were massive interventions from citizens, civil society organizations in particular, raised fundamentally important questions about this bill, this proposed legislation. And what was the controversy about? This bill gives the state the power to embargo information available to the public. And it can invoke national security as the criteria to limit access to information. So on the one hand, we've got PAIA, the Public Access to Information Act, which says that citizens through a process can access information relevant to their situation. This legislation has the potential to significantly undermine PAIA, but it's more dangerous than that, because you can prosecute a journalist who releases information in a newspaper story about abuse of public funds under this proposed legislation. And the argument by civil society organizations and citizens is that it is unhealthy in a democracy because it inhibits the flow of information and it can be used strategically to distort the flow of information in society. And because this is so controversial, and because people are really unhappy about this, and because the executive and the legislature know that the moment that's signed into law, it's going to the Constitutional Court, means that they are a bit too scared to sign it off and make it and put it in force. They know that this is a huge time bomb. And I think that that just shows the power of civil society citizens to engage on legislation that is problematic. And all that civil society organizations were asking for, something very simple, a whistleblower clause. So you know what a whistleblower is? If on the basis of deep reflection, you see something happening in your organization that's unethical, you reveal that information to someone who makes it public. And in that way you expose corruption, bad behavior, unethical conduct in your organization. And the big fight was to have an exclusion in terms of prosecution based on a whistleblower. And the legislature and the executive took a hard line on this. And that's what made people very worried about using this legislation to stop leaks to the media about the abuse of public funds and public resources. And they succeeded in blocking it or delaying its enactment. And that, I think, is a plus for South Africa's democracy. You can't just ram legislation through a parliamentary committee. People actually can do quite a lot to influence the nature of legislation, even if it's gone through these formal channels. And that's really, really important. So I've said a lot about legislation. What other things does the legislature do besides scream and shout and call points of order and points of principle and get thrown out and beaten up in Parliament? What else does the legislature do? They perform a fundamentally important function in a democracy, and we call that oversight. So we've got to get our terminology right here. there's some misuse of language in some of the literature. It's legislature oversight of the executive. It's not legislative oversight of the executive. It's legislature oversight of the executive. So what do we mean when we say oversight? It includes accountability. So I'm starting off with the easy ones so that we get to the really hard stuff of oversight. So the executive, as we've discussed, is accountable to the legislature. You can call a minister, you can call a head of department, you can call permanent officials from a department to explain to the elected representatives of the people what they've done with public money, what they've done in terms of addressing social, political, economic challenges facing the country. You can hold them to account for their actions. That's easy. Well, sometimes not so easy. Let's look at one possible problem here in terms of accountability. So if you're interested in policy research, a career as a researcher in Parliament, what I'm going to say now is something that will interest you enormously. Remember that people in the legislature are politicians. They aren't necessarily experts in the area of their responsibilities. They're good at catching votes, they're good at making speeches, they're good at making promises, and they're good at telling other people what to do, to put it crudely. And they're there for a short period of time, 5 years. If you're good at it, you'll get elected for another 5 years. If you're bad at it, you get thrown out, someone else takes your position. Okay? The guys deep down here in the executive, so we're not talking about your ministers, we're talking about the line function. Remember, they're permanent officials. They're career civil servants. They're not subject to a 5-year election cycle. So you will find senior officials here with 20 years of experience and expertise in a policy issue. So if you call someone here, the chief director on water affairs, to account here, is it an equal power relationship? No, it's fundamental imbalance, because knowledge is power. This guy knows the archive on the policy issue backwards. This guy's probably an engineer with deep understanding of geohydrology and other stuff. And you've got elected officials who aren't necessarily and often aren't experts in geohydrology. So it's quite easy for a technical official here to appear before an oversight committee and start to throw out statistics and numbers and technical stuff. And then how do these non-experts challenge the official talking that technocraties here? And this is a very, very serious problem in terms of holding the executive account, because your ministers will get the technocrats to write their answers for them in such a way that the legislature might not understand what's going on. So you've got a game going on here in terms of accountability. And the only way the legislature can perform some kind of accountability function is if this power balance is equalized in some way. And the way that it's equalized around the world is through researchers. The legislature will appoint on a permanent basis, so you become a permanent appointed official in Parliament as a researcher. And your job is to support committees to brief the members of the committees on how, or if not, why not the information given by these guys in the executive is accurate or not. So the role of the researcher becomes fundamentally important in ensuring that there is some kind of accountability. If you don't have research capacity in the legislature, that power balance that I've mentioned is a real problem. A real problem. So accountability is an important part of oversight. Other parts of oversight is transparency. There has to be a flow of information for you to be able to have accountability over the executive. So the reporting of the performance of this bureaucracy has to be transparent, and that's where the Auditor General is really important. Without transparency and information, you can't have accountability. So transparency is a key element in oversight. And you need something else if you're going to have oversight. And we haven't even defined oversight yet. We're going to define it in a second. You need something else. You need systems. You need a process for managing how information flows if you are going to have accountability and oversight. So there's got to be quarterly reporting where you submit your reports 2 weeks before the hearing so that people have a chance to hear it. Now, if those reports come in late and people don't have a chance to read it, obviously you can't have accountability. Right? So there's an incentive on these guys not to get their reports in on time. So if your systems are weak, there won't be a consequence for getting your reports in on time. If your systems are strong, the consequences will be so severe that these guys won't even try to pull that stunt and get their reports in the afternoon for the meeting taking place the following morning. So systems and how you manage those processes is fundamental to achieving oversight. So what is oversight? We've got a sense now of the elements, the things that have to be in place for oversight to take place. But what is oversight? It includes accountability, as we've said, but oversight is stronger. It's stronger than accountability. When we talk about oversight, we mean supervision. The legislature has the power, in some cases, to supervise the executive. If the legislature is of the view that elements of the executive or the executive itself is out of step and dysfunctional, the legislature, through constitutional and other legal powers, has the right to supervise the executive. So oversight is very, very strong. Supervision is a very powerful function.
What extent of that supervision, well, what is the extent of supervision?
It can go to the point of saying, for this afternoon we've got a budget which is drafted primarily by the executive, the Minister of Finance, and the officials in National Treasury. It could go to the point where the legislature could say to the Minister of Finance, your budget priorities are wrong. You're out of touch with what the needs of the country are. And we strongly suggest that you change the way you've weighted various expenses. And you take money from there and you put it there. So you supervise the Minister of Finance and National Treasury to change the budget. That's supervision. So softer forms of supervision are correction. Through interrogating the executive, you can correct errors. That's also an important part of oversight. So when we talk about legislature oversight of the executive, we're talking about something very important and very powerful. We said that the legislature, the executive is formed out of the legislature and gets special powers to do a whole lot of stuff. But now we're saying that through oversight, the legislature doesn't give away all its powers forever in forming the executive. It holds the power over the executive in terms of overseeing it, correcting it, supervising it, making sure that what the executive does is compatible with the mandates, the policies, the frameworks, the regulations, the expenditure rules, so that public resources are used in the most effective, efficient way possible. Because public resources are scarce. You use them better, you get better outcomes. You use them badly, you don't get good outcomes. And that's why oversight is so important. You hold the executive, the implementers, the policy makers to account for what they do. And if they do badly, you hammer them. You supervise them. You say, you haven't performed well, I'm now going to get involved in managing you so that you manage your department better. And the Constitution allows that. So I think we're clear now on why this oversight function is so important and what it means. So how do you carry through, how do you execute this oversight function in the legislature? What do you have to have in place to perform this oversight function? In South Africa, the Constitution sets out portfolio committees. And it's through these portfolio committees that the oversight function is performed. So for every department at national level, there will be a corresponding oversight committee in the legislature. So if you've got 35 national departments, you'll have 35, even more. There's a special portfolio committee I'll talk about in a second. You'll have 35 plus portfolio committees in the legislature. And the membership of those committees will be based on the representation parties have in the legislature.
So you cannot be apolitical and become an oversight committee member?
Well, you see, this is where things start to get interesting. Because the portfolio committees are clearly political. But in small groups, what happens through debate and contesting issues, the members get to know each other at quite an intimate level. And what happens on the whole is that they start to transcend their political boundaries and they start to act in the national interest. So your portfolio chairs will often do things against the political party that they come from. And it's based on the dynamics of small groups. Small group dynamics, very different to 400 people screaming and shouting in front of the cameras in the House of Assembly. No cameras in portfolio committees. Small groups, people can start to be much more trusting of each other and say things to each other because they know that it's not going to be damaging to them politically. And you start to build networks of trust in these committees. And these committees tend to start to act more in the national interest rather than their narrow political interest. In America, the Senate committees achieve this really, really well. Those Senate committees often transcend party political boundaries. You get Republicans saying things and supporting Democrats and vice versa based on a realization that this is the right thing to do. And that happens more frequently than we're aware of in South Africa. We focus on the divisions, but we don't focus on the unity that often emerges in these portfolio committees. So your researchers will be allocated to these portfolio committees. So specialist economists, specialist engineers, in terms of the relevant departments, during the briefing notes, the reports to the chair of the committee and the members of the committee, so that when they call these guys in, they're prepared, and you can have some kind of accountability oversight. And it works pretty well. It works pretty well. So that's at national level.
The party that has the second greatest number of votes, are they considered the official opposition?
Yes. Yes. So they, in the House of Assembly, would be the official opposition, but that doesn't translate into any special privileges.
Oh, so they don't like dictate, like there's no...
Not in portfolio
Oh, no.
committees. It's the chair of the portfolio committee, and that's normally from the party that has the majority of seats in the legislature.
So the person who's the chair of the oversight is overseeing themselves in a way?
Absolutely. But the pressures of being seen to do the right things means that in many instances, not all, you put the national interest above your party political interest, and you try and do the right thing. Because often the public hearings, which I spoke about earlier, will be convened by these portfolio committees. So civil society will petition and be given the right to address these portfolio committees. And people can write letters of complaint and all kinds of petitions to these portfolio committees. And if you're seen as being narrowly political, you're in for a very rough ride, because the parties in the committee will withdraw cooperation and start to stonewall and log roll and prevent progress, and then the intensity of the complaints will start to come through. So there are some controls on that. But you're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. There's a fine line between the executive and the legislature, even when it comes to oversight. I think you wanted to ask a question. Not. Okay.
Just
Is it follow on from there?
yeah. Just on that, the minute meetings, are they available to the public as well?
Which ones?
For the portfolio committee.
Yes, that's absolutely
So
public.
you can check to see the national interest.
Everything that happens in the legislature is public, without qualification. Everything that happens in the legislature arm at national, provincial and local levels public. And you can access that. And it's normally through the reports of the deliberations of these houses, through Hansard. So those reports are published a couple of days after each of the meetings, and you can access that. And there's an NGO that used to publish them on a daily basis, but I don't know if they do that anymore. But it's easily available, the public information on that.
Yes, actually, I have two questions. I don't know if I can pose them now or wait for the later.
Because you're showing some doubt, I'm going to slip in and say, let's hold it till later. Other people who just ask the question get away with it. So when you want to ask the question, otherwise you're going to get pushed to the end. Okay, so there we have the system of portfolio committees. Now, in the Westminster United Kingdom system of parliamentary governance, there's a very, very special portfolio committee that's crucial for us to take note of. It's called SCOPA, and I'm sure you've heard of SCOPA. Standing Committee on Public Accounts. So why is this SCOPA so important? It's important for the first reason that traditionally, in terms of the convention from the United Kingdom system of governance, that a non-majority party member chairs SCOPA. So this is the one committee where all the parties generally agree, it's not in law, generally agree that the chair should not be from the majority party. And the principle here is, as has been pointed out, you can't have the fox looking after the chickens. And that's why you give the chairship of this committee to an opposition party member. And that's how it's worked in the UK for hundreds of years, and that's how it's worked in South Africa since the inception of democracy post-94. So that's the first unique thing about SCOPA. The second unique thing about SCOPA is that it only interrogates public accounts. So it's in this committee that the Auditor General's reports are discussed and analysed, that ministers and departments are called in to explain why they, for the last 20 years, haven't implemented the recommendations of the Auditor General to improve financial management systems in government. So SCOPA deals directly with the issues of public finance. As we've discussed already, I won't repeat any of that stuff. Okay, so there we've got the basic systems, the basic structures of the legislature. What does all of this mean for municipalities at local government level? So does this translate itself down directly to municipalities, or are there all other kinds of things happening? So how do citizens at local level hold their elected councillors to account for making sure that the political heads and the appointed officials in the municipality fix the potholes, make sure the water's clean, make sure that electricity isn't too expensive? Is it as simple as national level? And I'm asking the question in this way because I want to suggest that it's not. It's actually much harder. So the first point at local level, based on what we said earlier, is if municipalities don't have access to national tax funds, where are your town councillors going to get the money from to employ researchers to perform that oversight function? So there's always a shortage of money at local level. And you can't just raise taxes because you've got very strict structures and processes for generating revenue at local level. At national, it's easy. You jack that up by 1%. You increase the petrol price by 50 cents a litre. Easy. At local level, you can't do that. So if there isn't money available, one of the cutbacks will be researchers. If you don't have enough researchers at local level, the same issues that we discussed at national level will become exacerbated, even more intense, at local level. So you'll have the same committees in your town council, formed and functioning on the same kinds of processes in terms of the oversight function. The difference at local government level is that there are very strict rules and processes for the council to perform an oversight function. You can't do things as broadly as you can at national level. The Municipal Systems Act defines very clearly in terms of Procedure A, Procedure B, how and when councillors can table certain issues for answering by the mayor, the mayoral committee, and the appointed officials in the departments at local level.
But that makes no sense.
I agree. I agree. I agree. If the pressure is on local government to meet the basic needs of citizens, surely it's at that level that you want the most effective, most powerful form of oversight. So if the water's not clean and potable, you want to be able to get that fixed quickly by screaming at someone who's scared of losing office, who's going to scream at someone else, who's going to get the problem fixed. But at municipal level, it doesn't work like that in terms of the rules and the regulations, in terms of how council functions and how reports are tabled and how things operate.
Could you change that with the general consensus of the people in that community? If you got communities in different municipalities in South Africa, I don't know, signing signatures or a general consensus to change just not the national but the municipal systems act.
Yes, that would be a national, you'd have to mobilize nationally because it's an act at national level
Right,
that defines the powers and the functioning of local government. So you would have to change the legislation at national level, which is not easy to do, but it can be done. It is possible, absolutely. But from what we've just said, do we now have an insight perhaps into why there are so many service delivery protests in South Africa? If oversight through elected representatives in the council over the executive at local government level is complex and rule-bound, it allows us to understand why frustrations in communities sometimes boils out into service delivery protests. Now, I'm not saying service delivery protests are purely service delivery protests. I would want to suggest they are highly political acts around the country, and it's not just service delivery issues that inspires them. But it allows us to have a better sense of why they break out. You don't get clean and potable water. You organize the people affected and you go to the council office and you protest and you force officials to listen to you, because that's one of the few mechanisms that you have to get an immediate response to your problem. At national level, you know when the portfolio committee is sitting in terms of the diary, and you can table an issue that will be there. You could even go and address the committee if it's so important. At local level, it's much harder to do that, strangely enough. Strangely enough. Okay, so we'll swing from left to right. Yeah.
I just have a question with regard to what's happening in the Western Cape in terms
Yes.
of local government. So you find that the Western Cape is governed by the Democratic
Yes.
Alliance. So there's a lot of shortage of toilets for people who stay in informal settlements, and there's always it's always a cause for contentious debate between the ANC and the DA with regard to who is responsible for providing those amenities. So the DA would say that no, it's the ANC's fault because they're not trickling down the funds, but then the ANC would be like, but then you're the local government, so you are responsible to provide that service. So in your opinion, who would you say is more accountable to provide that service to communities?
It's in the context, and I'm going to give a politician's answer here. It's in the context of these very important, emotional, volatile issues that the boundaries of accountability become blurred. And because these issues are so important and so hot and so politically loaded, that you have buck passing. So the DA says it's not our fault, it's the ANC who governed before us, they messed it up, and now you're blaming us for stuff they did. The ANC says, well, you the government, you got all the money, sort it out. How we get to the truth of this is not that important now, because it's elevated to a political level and it's got to be addressed through local government. So what happens? The local government re-looks at its budget, it takes money from early childhood development centres and puts them into sanitation systems. Why? Because young children can't protest and scream and shout. and that's how politics works. Another example at national level is the student protests. I hope none of you were involved in the student protests. So free education. I'll come to you now. Free education. I agree. Free tertiary education. As an academic, I think absolutely. I have no ethical, moral issues with it. To make the decision so quickly means that money from somewhere else has to be taken in terms of the budget to fund the shortfalls that universities aren't getting in terms of a 10% increase. So where's the money going to come from? Groups who can't scream and shout. Vulnerable groups. And that's the unfortunate thing about politics around the world. The squeaking wheel gets the oil. That's the phrase that we use in the literature. The more noise you make, the more resources you get, because politicians will give you money and resources and stuff to keep you quiet so that you vote for them the next time round. And that's one of the shortfalls of a democratic system, is that it sometimes responds in the short term to serious long-term issues. And in dealing with short-term issues like toilets in the Western Cape and university funding at national level now, is that you skew budget planning and you can seriously disadvantage people who sometimes need that resource much more than those who actually get it. And this is one of the tragedies. Democracy is not a perfect system. It's better than many others, but it's not perfect. And this, I think, is one of the main flaws of democracy. 10 minutes.
To your questions. To the question session.
Yes, so I've got 10 minutes to go.
To begin with the
questions. So
yes, because you'll have to stop it between 25 to 11:35 and 11:40. Then I'll stop you completely.
okay. No, we well on track. We well on track. We well on track. Okay, so points of clarification around municipal oversight issues. Yeah.
Well, you did mention that when it comes to the national government, that you have the funds to hire researchers in to help them with oversight, which makes sense, which makes them more effective. But regarding local government, like when you look at the portfolio committees, the portfolio committee consists mostly of councillors, right? And most of them don't have the capacity to understand the content that is being presented to them. And isn't there a way of screening the kind of people that can sit in that committee? Because I've been in a situation where like I was an intern with Cape Town last year, and I was interning with the Environmental Resource Management Department. And when we were going to present the projects that we were doing to the portfolio committee, they didn't take them seriously because we already knew that they were going to ask irrelevant questions. So it's not just like a formality, something that you have to do, but there's no accountability right there. So isn't there do you think it's possible to kind of have a screening process, that they can do to make sure that the committee consists of people that are actually capacitated?
All political parties try and do that, but when you come to the realm of politicians, as we discussed earlier, they get into office for skills that are very different to the technical skills needed by permanent officials. So to be a politician, you've got to be able to talk, you've got to be able to cut deals, you've got to be able to negotiate, you've got to be able to get people to like you, you've got to be able to crack jokes, you've got to be able to get stuff from A to B and make powerful groups happy. Those are the skills that politicians need. And that doesn't always correspond with technical understanding of complex issues. And this is one of the fracture lines in democratic systems of government around the world. There's a division between politicians on the one hand and officials on the other. And both have different jobs, different skills. And you hope that the officials will balance out the politicians, but not always. So politicians, short-term, electoral cycles, officials, long-term, what are the real needs that need to be done? And through this tension, you hope that the outcomes will more or less meet the needs of society. But sometimes it doesn't work that way. Sometimes short-term thinking prevails. And you end up doing stuff in the short term that gets votes, but is a disaster 10, 15 years later. Absolutely. And this is one of the unsolvable dilemmas of democratic systems. It's not perfect, but it's better than many other systems.
Okay, so apologies for this, but I had like 5 questions.
Okay. You've hesitated, so I'm going to say let's wait for the end.
Yes, it's really insightful. I'd like to just thank you personally from someone who's been studying this for about 3 years to find someone who's actually going to help materialize the theory that we've been given in university. So firstly, thank you for that. Okay, first question. How does the system work where, a political party can win provincially,
Yes.
but nationally one party wins? Because to answer this question, I understand where that confusion may be,
Yes.
because now then fulfills the needs of that province. So let's just use ANC and DA for democratic sake.
Yes.
So you have the ANC winning nationally, but here in this province, the DA has won.
Yeah.
Who then is responsible for materializing the policy? Okay, but now if the mayor and the premier now are from different parties as well,
Absolutely.
how do the people get their services to be provided? Because now it's not going to be about the people, it's going to be about party politics. Because as you said, so provincial is the DA, national is the ANC, but the mayor is IFP even. I don't know.
Indeed, absolutely right.
So where is there legislature that has been drawn up, like, or some sort of bill or some sort of constitutional analysis around this? Because this is probably one of the main problems. It's not the actual service delivery, it's party politics getting in the way.
There are a whole range of things.
Yeah.
But let's stick to one, because what you raised there can keep us busy for 2 days. What you're talking about here is essentially what we call in the literature your electoral system. And you've got different kinds of managing your electoral system. In the United Kingdom, they operate on a first post constituency system. So you divide the country up into a number of small constituencies, and parties contest each constituency. And first past the post means 50 plus 1% wins, and this guy goes to Parliament. The guy who loses has to try better next time, and all the votes that went to the loser evaporate into thin air. So it's potentially quite a problematic electoral system, because these votes, whether it's 40% or 48%, don't count in terms of representation. So those guys lose any representation in your national parliament. In opposition to this, you've got a different system, which is what South Africa uses, which is called proportional representation. So we don't break it down into constituencies. We have national and provincial elections based on party votes. And all the parties make a list from 1 to 400 at national level, or 1 to 500, in case people die or resign, etc. And depending on the number of votes you get through a complex provincial formula, you will get representation in Parliament. So 400 seats, if you get 60% of the votes, that will give you 60% of the 400 seats. Which means that no vote is lost in a PR system. All votes will translate in some way into representation in Parliament in terms of how you aggregate all the votes. So we went for a PR system in 1994 because it would empower minorities. It was part of the deal, the transition deal. Without PR, there would have been almost no minority representation in Parliament, which would have been a very bad thing in terms of getting a new democracy off to a good start. So now we're starting to see some of the limits of PR, which is the point raised earlier about if you're a chair of a portfolio committee, you are only there because you have a position on the party list. Who controls the party list? The party leader. Who's the party leader? Well, strictly speaking, the party leader in the majority party is also the state president. So are you going to hold the state president to account if you are essentially from the same party and your position on the list depends on how nice you are to the hierarchy in the party? So we are starting to see oversight limitations coming through in terms of PR here. So PR in South Africa is at national and provincial level, and at local level it's messy because we've got a combination of constituencies and PR. So we're trying to say ward councillors must represent particular communities because it's the people who hold the councillors accountable, so they've got to know exactly who they are and they've got to live in that area that they represent. But at the same time, you don't want to waste votes for candidates who lose a ward election. and then you've got a separate process to calculate how many people from each party in terms of the PR side will be in the council as well. So this is our municipal electoral system is actually pretty good as a compromise between these two extremes.
Can it not be that, for example, if it's the DA that is provincial and the ANC that is national, that in that province, it can be divided by the 4 largest parties? So, like for example, ward councillors, etc.
Yes.
They still are in charge of their community. So because now I'm the ward councillor and I am from the DA,
Yeah.
I have to do
Absolutely.
500 toilets.
Absolutely.
It's just what I have to do. And then the other person who maybe the ANC is the party that's in charge of this province, even though the ward councillor is from the DA, has to also do 500
Absolutely.
toilets. So
Yeah,
like
that's
that.
why at local level, because of the constituency element, you can have other parties emerging as majorities in the council with a very strong base at ward level. So you can have these variations depending on the number of seats set in the council and which party wins them.
So the problem now is actually not the system, it's the fact that, going back to what you said at the beginning, the money does not trickle down.
Well, the money always makes things worse. Good systems will limit the negative effects of money. If you've got bad systems, then you're just going to have a rough
So
time
then what
irrespective.
Titsolela said is basically not a system, it's not a system problem, systematic problem, but it's more a resources
Well,
problem.
there are a whole range of things.
Okay.
Whole range of things. Nothing is ever one or two. It's always complicated. So in terms of PR, you get allocated a constituency. You don't have to live in that constituency. So that undermines accountability straight away. In the Westminster system, if you want to stand for Parliament in a constituency, you have to be a resident for a set number of years before you can even come into contention for representing a political.
Why not you implement that?
Because we've got a past, we've got this apartheid legacy where people don't own property, where people didn't have access to land, where you didn't have birth certificates, where you had a whole. You can't exclude people from the franchise because of that legacy. And that's one of the many reasons why we went for PR, and it allows us to be as inclusive as possible with the least amount of technical nonsense that would end up excluding people.
What is the model, where is the PR combined with constituencies model hold from? Are there other countries that would model?
Yeah, when you get to electoral systems, things can really start to get complicated. We've got our two extremes, constituency and PR, and there's practices in between these two extremes. So we can.
So it wasn't one specific place that's on our
No, I think it was a realization that the old constituency system has some validity, but you can't throw votes away just because someone lost. So it was a pragmatic compromise. I don't think they were looking at any particular system in devising this for South Africa. That's why I think it's so good. When you bring other models in, you end up with trouble. If you devise something that works for you to solve a problem in your own place, it's more likely to be effective. Time.
No, it's a question.
Yes.
Yes, General. Thank you very much. On the issue of land,
Yes.
the ANC says they want to expropriate but with compensation.
Yes.
And the EFF says they want to expropriate without compensation, but for equal redistribution.
Yeah.
And the DA says they want to create a good environment or healthy environment for the poor.
Yes.
Basically, if you look at Gauteng or the Johannesburg Metro, you find that the people who owns the land is the people at the north, like north of Johannesburg mostly, even the residential land, if it goes to that extent. And how is it possible that these three parties, either one of them, allocate land in the southern part of Johannesburg, so that people can a land can bring transformation. That land shouldn't go to the few, because when you look at the locations, there's a lot of malls, whereas this land would have been benefiting the residents of the area. What is it that parties should do so that people can also benefit, not only residential land, and to regenerate the economy of that particular area? And then my second question would be...
The first one is more than enough.
but okay, I'm concluding. The issue of dolomitic areas. Yeah, I know the DA, it's quite vocal on that issue. So I would like you to also elaborate on that issue.
The second one is much easier than the first one.
Oh, okay.
If there's dolomite, you're not allowed to build houses.
Yeah.
Because dolomite is a kind of rock under the ground, and with water it dissolves. And what happens is you get hollow caves under the ground, and then you have sinkholes. So there are parts of Johannesburg where you've got huge amounts of dolomite, and it's really unsafe to build houses or any infrastructure. The most you can do with that is it's even unsafe for agriculture, because the people working there could become victim to a sinkhole at any point in time. It's very hard to predict when these sinkholes happen. So that's easy. Just in terms of health and safety, you don't want to use dolomitic land. You want to ring fence it and turn it into a nature reserve. The second question is, I'm going to be a politician and answer that in a political way, and say, my mandate was to talk about the institutions of government. What you're raising is a policy issue. When you have a speaker talking on how to do policy analysis and how to formulate policy implementation strategies, it might be better and more appropriate for that person to deal with the very sensitive and very important issues that you've raised. So I am going to circumvent that one.
No, it's fine. Okay, let's go.
That is a hot potato.
Yeah, let's go back to the dolomite issue. The Living Party, I've noticed that they're using it as a bureaucracy to the public, using the dolomite. They don't want to develop the area. They would say, no, this
But
area...
when you say they're using it, are you saying that they're being dishonest?
Yeah, to an extent.
Because it's really unsafe. I've explained that you don't want to be ploughing a field and a sinkhole forms.
Yes. You know what
You
I'm
might
saying
be
is-
happy for someone else to be ploughing that land when the sinkhole forms, but you don't want to be there when the sinkhole.
All right. Yeah, but I'm saying this because there's in certain areas, I know there's development. You'll find that even today they're building infrastructure, maybe like they're building roads,
Yeah.
building schools, erecting malls,
Yeah.
libraries, and if really it is dolomitic, I think because they're relocating people from area A to area B,
Yeah.
I think it's a waste of state resources. If that's the case.
If what you say is happening is true. If.
Yes.
So let's establish whether that's true or not before we take a discussion further.
Thank you very much.
Which means that one's got to go to all the reports in town council, by the land surveyor's office, by the planning office, the hydrological reports, which will map out where the dolomite is, and then you've got to correlate where the malls are in relation to the dolomite. And if you see that the malls are built in the good land and people are pushed out of the good land, then you have a case. If it's not like that, then you don't have a case. So there's a huge evidential burden on one making that claim to pursue that at a political level. And that's where research and policy analysis becomes really important.
So, to circumvent that, how do you go about, as an activist in that particular area, how do you, or what do you knock, so that
You go
for assistance?
So now you're asking me for policy strategic advice as an activist in the community.
Yes, I got you.
I think we can move into questions now, because I've covered the basic concepts, the basic ideas. So I'm going to answer this one quickly, and then we're going to start the question time.
You can take maybe, okay, you can exhaust my questions and take maybe additional 2 questions.
So
and then close the session.
The simple answer to your question is the municipality has a geological survey, and it's an open public document. And what you need to do is access that by going into the Department of Planning at Town Council and going through that and making sure that your facts are right, by mapping and then making the case should you be proved right. But without that evidence, you are on difficult ground. Excuse the metaphor.
Yeah, you can let's take 5 questions and then close the session.
Okay, so some people have asked questions already. So let's start off with people who haven't asked questions, and then we'll come back to people who have already asked questions towards the end. So you've asked a question already.
No, I did not ask
You
a
haven't.
question. The first question is actually goes right at the beginning of the session, so I cannot, what you call this, put it properly, but hopefully I hope you'll understand. There was, you made a statement about the lack of creativity in creating, I forgot what, but where ESCOM gives 7% or maybe sells 7%. So now my question is actually, what is the better alternative to this whole process?
Well, there are amazing things that municipalities can do in terms of energy and electricity. So I saw in the outline that you have or will have a speaker on the green economy and renewable energy. Have you had that session yet?
No.
Okay, so let me cut the ground away from that person who's coming to speak to you. So, at municipal level, what resource or what thing do municipalities have a lot of that people don't want? And the answer is sewerage. So if you manage your sewerage systems in an innovative, different way, you can capture methane. And you can use that methane as a fuel to generate electricity. You can use the methane to drive municipal transport. Now that fuel will not be linked to the petrol price. It won't be linked to the coal price, which means that you can drop the prices of electricity generation. So if your production of electricity is close to zero, whatever you sell it on to the citizens for, you're making a huge profit. So instead of 7%, you could actually make much more and still keep the price down for consumers. So it's that kind of thinking that we need to see happening at local level. And there are many other examples of that. Rooftop solar PV panel, all of that stuff.
And the second question is, when you indicated, I think it's a SCOPA, it's the
Yes.
Committee of Public or something like that. Is it possible then, with all the complications around it, office or around it committee, is it possible that government or the legal institution or whatever that is responsible for this, that they apply or they actually depute people who are not politicians, people who are experts, like maybe public citizens, like how we have in IEC, where we have non-party political people of it, and what's preventing it from happening?
Well, as a portfolio committee in Parliament, it is a political body,
Okay.
by definition. What you would hope for is that you've got highly technical, qualified researchers working in that committee, people with BCom accounts, hopefully even chartered accountants, people who really know how to run numbers and understand income and expenditure, so that when the officials, the CFOs from departments come and give you 20 years of files to explain, you've got someone that can go through those numbers quickly and identify whether it's true or not. So you need technical capacity in Scopa for Scopa to be meaningful.
So it has to be from political members.
All portfolio committees in national parliament, provincial legislature, and town council committees, where you've got scopers as well at local level. All those committees are by definition political. You can't have outsiders being part of that, because then you are breaking separation of powers in terms of your legislature, your executive. So that line of separation of powers runs right through the 3 tiers of government.
I have a problem because where I'm from, pre-94, there was a hydroelectric station, right? And it used to operate just to supply electricity, but after 94, it just stopped, and no one knows what happened. So I just want to know, is it maybe because now municipalities have to buy electricity from ESCOM, then sell it back to us, or I don't understand what really happened.
Yeah.
Everyone is just confused why this station just stopped to operate.
Now, there will be a paper chase at whichever level of government was responsible for that. So I don't know your area, I don't know the hydro scheme that it's part of, but there will be a reason why it was stopped. And it could be terribly complicated, like that the water flow, the catchment area, wasn't producing enough water to drive this on a sustainable economic basis. And therefore the turbines were getting worn down because there wasn't enough water to push them at their optimal speeds. So it becomes very, very technical to dig in and find out the exact reasons for this. It may have been too far from the grid, so you lose electricity in putting wires from the scheme to the national grid. The loss of power and the cost of maintaining the electricity wires to get it from A to B may have been too high, and therefore it wasn't sustainable. So there are a whole range of reasons, and one would have to identify who was responsible for that scheme and then go through the reports where the decision is made and motivated for. And they will exist, and that's where researchers have lots of work to do, is to go and dig those documents out, because they do exist. In government, you can't make a decision without a paper chase. There is always a paper chase. And that's why that bill that I mentioned is so worrying, because that allows government to stop access to certain information. But there's always a paper chase. And as a researcher, you just got to find the right papers by fighting provincial, local, national to get the documents relevant to that issue. So I haven't given you an absolute answer, I've given you a sense of what needs to be done to answer your concern.
But isn't that become a bit difficult since it operated under the apartheid government, and during the transition there was a lot of information which was lost?
The archive will be in the Department of Energy. If it's a national project, it will be there in the Department of Energy. If it was a provincial project or a regional project or a homeland project or a Bantustan project, it will be incorporated into the existing provincial structure. So you would have to track back and find where the documents are on that issue. But they do exist, there's no doubt about it. Yes?
I just wanted to ask, concerning the bill, the information bill, is there a discussion about the very existence of the bill, or is it elements of the bill that people are not happy with? Because even in America and Britain, there is
Absolutely.
such acts. So is it how its current form? That's the issue, not necessarily its existence.
Well, there's a huge controversy. South Africa has got more than enough existing legislation to manage documents and information that is sensitive to national security. So opponents to this bill are saying, why do we need another one? So that's the one objection. And then the other objection is on the specific aspects of it, especially the exclusion of whistleblowing and other forms of access through a process, a legal process to access information. In other words, to hold those who declare information secret to account for their decisions, to make sure they're doing it for the right reasons, not the wrong reasons. And it's not clear how people, if at all, could appeal a decision to close that off. So you're right, all democracies around the world have that, and one understands why. If a journalist gets a document with a list of intelligence operatives in a neighboring country, obviously you want to stop that information from going into the newspapers. Because the moment it hits the newspapers, those guys are dead. And it's not in the national interest. So that's an extreme example. But below the extreme, there are a whole range of potential abuses. And people are quite nervous that that legislation doesn't allow for sufficient correction through engagement to prevent abuse, hence the concern, hence the political nature of it, and the reason why the president hasn't signed it into law. It's a real hot potato. Yes.
I was just wondering, what does our government structures and how our government and how we operate, what does that say, if anything at all, about international relations and affiliations with other international groups?
Yeah. You're not referring to the International Criminal Court and the leader of Sudan who came to South Africa, and the whole process that's unfolding around why he wasn't arrested and handed over to the ICC.
All of that.
Because if you were asking that, I was going to circumvent it.
Oh, okay.
South Africa signs a range of international treaties through the United Nations, through a whole range of other international organizations. The international climate change process, we've signed a whole lot of stuff there. The Kyoto Protocol on greenhouse gases, we've signed. So in terms of international treaties and protocols, South Africa has signed them, just about all of them. There are very few that it hasn't signed. And those protocols in some ways have shaped national legislation and national policy. So South Africa's climate change program is directly linked to its commitments made in those other international, I know those reasonably well. But in terms of legal, in terms of Interpol, in terms of resource management, in terms of trade and tax and all of that, South Africa signed them all, and they work reasonably well. Some of them, you sign them and you forget about them. That's the nature of international relations. It's highly political. So you only focus on the ones that suit you. And what suits you changes over time.
So in this, with the WTO then, and one of the committees, the committee is the one specifically about investment and employment. What does that then say about the political nature of all the political affiliations on an international level, and how they influence government?
Those high-level committees become very technocratic and less political. So if you sign the WTO treaties, you're obligated to comply with all of that stuff in terms of competition and etc. And it becomes very hard to not play by those rules. So if there are points of dispute, there's a whole dispute resolution process built into the WTO. So if country A thinks you're dumping stuff in them, they can declare a dispute and then you have a hearing. Now, where South Africa is at a major disadvantage when it comes to these processes, and we saw this with AGOA recently, is that the other countries will come with 2 members of the front desk and like 5 members of the second row, all NLB graduates from the best universities in the world in international trade law, and then officials with computers digging data as the debate unfolds, feeding notes to the middle desk, to the front desk. South Africa arrives at these meetings, and in the taxi on the way to the WTO head office, they say, well, how are we going to deal with this? And then they arrive and they discover that they've been completely outmaneuvered. So it becomes a capacity planning issue in terms of how you can use these rules to your advantage. But you can't go there gung-ho. You can't wing it there, because guys take this really seriously. And it's not just WTO, it's a whole range of forums where South Africa and many other developing countries, for similar resource capacity reasons, get completely outmaneuvered. They just don't have that technical expertise available to the public representatives in those forums to provide them with that backup. In America, it's easier. There are thousands of econometricians with PhDs from Harvard who would love to be in the middle row in those hearings. South Africa, we just tend not to have that capacity, or as much as we'd like. Other developing countries, it's even worse. So when the technical stuff starts coming, and we discussed it in the context of accountability already, you can see how some countries at a global level are at a structural disadvantage. They just can't fight their case as best as they otherwise might be able to. And it's very sad, because you can lose a good case for the wrong reasons, and that's what sometimes happens. You get completely outmaneuvered.
Thank you, Revolution. Thank you very much, sir, Professor Sarakinsky. We're very humbled that you've shared this information with us. More doors are open for you. You can still come back. We don't have time. I wish we could speak more than this, but our time is over. Will you please give Professor a round of applause?
The debate series that you have, the public debates on the School of Governance, those are open to everybody? Okay. And I saw it just got they don't have exact dates on the website. It just got March 2016. Yes. Where do we find the exact dates?
When the speakers are confirmed and the venue's booked, then there'll be adverts in the media.
Okay.
So we tend to advertise a lot in the Mail and Guardian, on our websites, on the exact dates and times of those season. So you're more than welcome. Absolutely.
The School of Governance.